Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the International Solidarity Pod, which is a podcast that aims to explore current affairs and history relating to imperialism, the global south, gender, political economy, and people to people ties. I'm your host, Ashwin. Be sure to subscribe to our channel and give this video a like. We count on your support. Today, we have on Tings Chak, who is the art director and Asia coordinator of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, as well as the editor of Wenhua Zongheng. In our conversation, we discussed the poverty alleviation campaign in China and how it was conducted, the question of women's liberation in China, and the future of the one country, two systems policy in Hong Kong and Macau. In addition to whichever platform you're watching or listening to this on, you can follow the work I do on Instagram at Journal of INTL Solidarity and on Substack at intlsolidarity.substack.com. If you're listening to this on either Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please leave a review as it helps get this program to new listeners. Here's my conversation with Tings. Okay, Tings, welcome to the International Solidarity Pod. Thank you for making the time to be here. We're going to talk about sort of a whole bunch of things here, but first focusing on the poverty alleviation campaign in China. The number is something like 850 million people have been lifted out of extreme poverty. That was around the 2021 mark, if I'm not wrong. That's around 65, if I'm not wrong, percent of the population of China. So something very interesting going on there. Could you maybe take us from there, set the scene for us. What has China's poverty alleviation campaign been able to achieve? How is extreme poverty defined? Yeah.
Absolutely. First of all, thanks, Ashwin, for having me on your program. It's a real pleasure to share a little bit about what we've been studying at the Tricontinental about China and also just my experiences having been living here in mainland China for the last few years. I think the poverty alleviation campaign, of course, the numbers you cited is from a particular period, which is since the opening reform period, basically marked by 1978 onwards. And that 850 million figure, which is really impressive, is responsible for or equivalent to 76% of the global poverty reduction happened in China. So this is of world significance, not just around, a sort of victory or improvements for the Chinese people, but really for the people of the global South. And maybe I want to just start off by saying, to try to contextualize the importance of this, is that, in 1949, when the People's Republic of China was founded, China was an extremely poor country. I mean, of course, coming out of semi-colonialism, a century of humiliation, the stories I think many of your listeners will know about. China at that point was considered the 12th poorest country in the world by GDP per capita standards. That's something like eight African countries, actually 11th, sorry, I misspoke. Eight African countries and two Asian countries were poorer in those standards. So to be able to, about 70 years later, to emerge and say that extreme poverty has been eradicated in countries so large, so vast, and coming out of such conditions is something I think historic. And I'm not using that word lightly. Unfortunately, I think in a lot of the Western media, these stories were just either dismissed, censored, or just, seen as Chinese propaganda. Um, One of the things I think right before the announcement, which happened at the end of 2020, this completion of the campaign, which this last period in the last 10 years, it lifted the last 100 million people out of extreme poverty. That basically, with this so-called Chinese miracle after the opening reform, with extreme growth, rapid development, and such, I really don't like the word miracle because I think dismisses the aspects of planning, state planning, the role of the Communist Party itself in being able to drive a process that has these social elements to it. But that being said, there were still many people, especially in very remote areas in the western or central regions of the country, that had not seen the economic benefits yet. They were still living in conditions of extreme poverty. So this last period of what we call the targeted poverty alleviation was lifting that final 100 million people, which, of course, for your listeners in Canada, that's something like three times the population of Canada, just in, less than a decade. So it's massive. And one of the things that the UN Secretary General Antonio Gutierrez had said And I'm quoting him. He said that every time I visit China, I'm stunned by the speed of change and progress. And you have created one of the most dynamic economies of the world, helping more than, he used 800 million people lift themselves out of poverty. It's the greatest anti-poverty achievement in history. And I think this lift themselves out of poverty, hopefully we can talk a little bit more in terms of how the process went, because it's not just a kind of paternalistic, now the government comes in and, implements a policy or hands out money and poverty resolved. It's very much how you activate the masses, mobilize all of society in order for such an achievement to be made. Um, and maybe I'll just say one thing, because you did mention how China measures poverty. I think it's important. We have these sort of UN World Bank standards that places, I think, what is it, $1.3 a day, something like that, as your sort of income on an income basis. But of course, we know income alone does not determine whether or not someone's poor. There's many other aspects. There's multidimensional factors, such as, do you have healthcare? Do you have access to decent education? Do you have housing? Do you have running water? All these aspects contribute to how poverty is understood. And so China adopted this kind of multi-dimensional metrics, which has, of course, as a baseline, the poverty, income standard. But, and in fact, when measure it in purchasing power parity, it's actually higher than what the World Bank's standard is. But next to that, there's something called the two no worries. Basically, the idea that food and clothing are not the daily worries of a person. Of course, we know that that has to be a true thing for someone to be considered out of living out of poverty. And the other three things are considered the three guarantees, which is the guarantee of access to basic health care, um, public education, which in China is 9 years, and then housing that is safe and with running water and electricity. So with that grouping, that set of metrics is what Chinese government use to consider whether or not a person has exited extreme poverty. So I think in that sense, it's a much more, broad, comprehensive understanding of what poverty is than just saying, how much money do you have in your bank account? And that helps secure and help secure, possible slip back into poverty, which is very common, right? Because if it's just about a government handout of money, that might be a band-aid solution. But how it's education, it's healthcare, it's these factors that can help lift people out of the cyclical generational poverty that we see in many, many parts of the world, not only the global south.
Thanks for that, Tings. That's a good rundown. Can you now perhaps give us a sense of, how this campaign took place? How does the Communist Party operate at a more granular level, in how they conducted this campaign? How are they addressing geographical disparities? You mentioned the central and western regions. I imagine there are cultural disparities. There are, 55 ethnic minorities in China. So, some details on that. Also, I would probably add, since you mentioned it, the dimension of how are folks, also lifting themselves out of poverty, as you mentioned.
Yeah, and so the last few years I had the opportunity to actually spend a lot of time in the countryside. And the first moment was to go to Guizhou province, which is in the southwest of China, to be able to go and actually see what this poverty alleviation campaign was. Going to some of the counties. It's a region where the last counties were lifted out of extreme poverty. And it was really informative to be able to talk with, party leaders, local officials, but as well as just women, peasants, youth about their experiences, because very much everyone, when I say everyone was mobilized for this, campaign to be successful, it really felt like that. And I think this is one of the aspects in terms of how the Communist Party operates, is very, I think, misunderstood, especially in the West, because there's a sense that, there's a one-party state, therefore it's kind of a, authoritarian state. Whatever the president says becomes, the rule, the law for everyone, and then, you just have to follow in suit. But of course, in a country of 1.4 billion people, in a territory so big, it's impossible for, to rule with an iron fist, if you will. So oftentimes, at the top levels, senior levels, we'll take a kind of decision around, okay, eradicating extreme poverty by 2020 as one of the what's called the centenary goals. It was the centenary goal for the 100th year after the foundation of the Communist Party of China, which was founded in 1921. So they set a very lofty, very, very ambitious goal. That's at the top level, but how does that actually play out in the levels below, in all five levels of government and down at the grassroots, becomes something quite decentralized and in practice. And this is where you'll see, quite interestingly, different kinds of, let's call them, I think they're democratic practices. For example, in the villages, how a family is considered to be, impoverished or poverty-stricken is the word, because of course they're not by nature poor. It's that they have been under certain historical conditions made to be poor, right? And so they use the word poverty-stricken, which I actually prefer. Um, and they will hold, and this is how a lot of the local governance works in the grassroots level, hold these sort of what are called democratic assemblies where people just discuss their situation. They might discuss about their family members or their neighbors and discuss the policy. How does it work? Come up with collective ideas so that each family, because household is really the unit of the, the social structure in China, um, to come up with these ideas in conjunction with the party leaders, of course, that are leading this process. And you get to see how these things play out, sort of a national level vision down to the grassroots, where it becomes a very, very kind of democratic process in a way. But that being said, I think it's how this mobilization, I think what we can understand is, of course, it's the Communist Party that leads and drives the process. But the Communist Party alone cannot complete this task. So I'll give you an example. When the government came out with those metrics that we just talked about what is considered extreme poverty, then you have to figure out, who are the poor? Who are the poverty-stricken people? In countries so big, how do you do that? Well, you send the party cadre. In that first moment in 2014, the party sent 800,000 party members to go to over 120,000 villages around the country to basically knock on doors and understand the situation. How is the housing situation? Is there water here? What is, your daughter's education level, etc. And it's through that process, not some sort of statistical, abstract sort of, sort of non-grounded way to kind of come up with a policy, to actually go to the ground. And it's through that they identified the nearly 100 million people that still fit that category. And then the second phase was to actually send people to go and live and work in the countryside with these families. And so the second phase, there were 3 million cadre that were actually sent to live, oftentimes for 1, 2, 3, or 4 years at a time. I had a chance to talk with some of them. One particular Secretary Liu, which in the study that we published called Serve the People, the Eradication of Extreme Poverty in China, which is available for download if anyone wants to read and learn more about the process. So the Secretary Liu, I followed him around, got to talk with him, and how it works is that he was paired with five families, so one party cadre for five families, and he basically spent those 2 years knowing all the issues and problems of each family. He was basically the person that the family called if, my son doesn't want to go to school anymore. We know how important school is, but can you please go talk to him and convince him? Or, my aunt lost her job. Can you help us think of a solution? To also working with the larger community to figure out what is it that the community needs to do to be able to generate incomes. For example, in that particular place, we looked at the grapefruit agricultural cooperative that they had established. The task of these kind of party cadre with the local officials is there. How do you get the resources, perhaps from the eastern regions, which are more developed, have resources? How do you pair with it could be a state-owned enterprise or it could even be a private enterprise? Because part of it is not just mobilizing the party, as I said, but being able to mobilize the other sectors of society. And this is also under direction of the party. So not only sending party members, I actually got to meet many people who were working, for example, for private companies, who were also, because their companies had, established an east-west connection, and made certain investments there as part of their commitments, their social commitment. They would also send workers and that would live for periods of time to make that, company or investment work out. You see that at the level of, teachers, doctors. People got, for example, free university education to be trained as doctors. And for that, you would spend 2 years in the countryside working. You even see that in levels of governance, which is really fascinating, where, cities would pair with each other, not in these sort of symbolic twin cities, which I don't even know what those mean and most of the time, but actually mean that you might send your vice mayor from the eastern region, and the vice mayor would go and spend 2 years with the local mayor and basically share all this governance experience, knowledge. So when you think about it, it's these various sectors as a under this broader national campaign. And it's very fascinating when you look at it because that's when you also, it's part of the political conscientization of many people. Because if you're living in a tier one, we call it, one of the most developed or, high income cities, say in like Shenzhen or, Shanghai or something like that, and that you probably never spent much time in the countryside. So for you to actually go and see what the people are living like in much poor and underdeveloped conditions is something that also transforms a lot of people in the process. And in this process too, you also see the conscientization of the local people. I met with this woman leader. She's a young leader, and she was saying that she was herself lifted out of extreme poverty, her family members as well. And it's through that process that she actually gained the confidence and ended up joining the party. It's quite a lengthy process and becoming a local party leader because she gained the confidence in the initial part when she started getting, engaged in this campaign. There were lots of, you know, let's say, like her husband wasn't very excited, that she was kind of becoming more politically confident, because, maybe her task was to be stay at home, other things like that. But over this process, she also said, no, I actually feel like I have gained from this campaign. I want to become a party member. And then now she's a local leader in a community of about 11,000 people who had been moved to a new community from some of the most, rural and remote areas from her region. Anyways, I can go on about many, many stories. Most of them are in that study that I mentioned. But they're really, I think, not, they're touching stories, but I think it helps you understand this question of the kind of granular level on the day-to-day of how policy, reaches the grassroots.
Thanks for that. Yeah, that really gives us, I think, a good look at that. Um, okay, so yeah, and I think another point worth mentioning is that you mentioned that, poverty alleviation is a big deal, um, looking at, the recent history of China and, even for example before 1949, 1947. I'm Indian as well, so I always compare India and China. We have an episode with Jyotishman, whose show you've been on I think several times, just comparing India and China and sort of the development indicators. But before liberation in China and before Indian independence, China was poorer than India. So, that is a big deal. And at the point that I wanted to come to was that this is not just, among the global South, a huge accomplishment that's worth study, but even within China's own 1,000+ year old history, several thousands of year old history, this is a big deal, arriving at the point where you eradicate some kind of or a substantive, poverty. Um, okay, so many people outside China, especially, see the Communist Party as being marked by, two eras, namely before and after the reform and opening up in 1978. We can talk about how that itself is sort of flawed. Even before 49, there were changes in how the Communist Party oriented itself. Um, but China sees itself as having embarked on a new era, or a third era after 2012. Can you tell us a little bit more about this new era and how it relates to previous eras? What kind of changes does this new era bring? I imagine, poverty alleviation is sort of characteristic of this new era, hence why I'm asking this question.
Yeah, I think it's an important one. I think because it helps us understand that, the People's Republic of China as a socialist experiment really is something quite young still. And it's gone through different periods of different eras, different periods of self-transformation or correction of path, lessons and all the zigs and zags, as our, dear comrade Lenin likes to say, of history. And so we have to look at China's development with that lens. And I think sometimes, as you mentioned, many outside people outside of China, including many Western leftists, I think don't have that historical patience to see how young this process is for the challenges, the tall challenges that it had to confront, and it's still confronting. It's not a finished process. I mean, we've been talking about poverty alleviation. I mean, that's a minimum program, right? Eradicating extreme poverty is by no means the goal of socialism. Of course, is a necessary stage to be able to get advanced in the next phase of development. But that being said, I would actually say, and I won't go into too much, but I often like to put these, if we're going to put periods in, I think the first period of social experimentation is actually not before 1949. It's in that period of the 1930s and 40s, since the establishment of the first Soviet revolutionary government down in Beijing or in the south of China, in Jiangxi, where the first experiments of dealing with questions such as poverty or hunger, food production, land reform, challenging, all the patriarchal feudal traditions, etc., began. Then we have Long March, we have the Yan'an period. Anyways, we could go on, but I think that period was already rich, basically 2 decades of social experimentation and governance that the Chinese Communist Party, the Communist Party of China, brought in 1949. They didn't start that process in 1949. Of course, then we have different periods. But of course, your question is around understanding the new era since the 18th Party Congress in 2012, since President Xi Jinping came into power. And I think it's an important one. One of the things, of course, during it's highly misunderstood about the period of opening reform under Deng Xiaoping is there's an understanding, I think, especially amongst the left and right, that that was basically a death knell to socialism. That's the proof that China had gone a capitalist path because now we're bringing back in private capital. China's integrating itself into the international economic system. It made the deal with the devil with the U.S. since, the visit of Nixon to China, etc. But I think it's important to understand that was also a period of self-transformation, understanding that, yes, China had made huge gains under the first socialist period under Mao Zedong. When we're talking about uh, life expectancy, illiteracy, women's emancipation, land reform, basically across the gamut, including, the basic industrial development. It sent, satellites to the sky, created, atomic weapon. Like, I mean, it's many, many scientific and technological and industrial advances as well. But there was an understanding already that, China was extremely poor and isolated still and needed to be incorporated into the international world market, get the technology investments from the world to be able to learn from it to get to this phase. So we see that period of extreme growth, that miracle that we mentioned earlier, but what coming to 2012, a lot of the contradictions also started to emerge. I think many people started pointing to, well, there's so many billionaires in China. The inequality, was, far exceeded the period of the, early socialist period. We see many, many kinds of questions around the environment. In fact, that's something we've been focusing a lot on the environmental question and China's sort of more recent ecological transition. In fact, we just published an issue of our journal that we published at Tricontinental called 文化纵横 that's also available on our website if you are interested in that question of the environment. Um, and so when she comes into power, there's also initiating a new era, which is I kind of think of it as a new self-transformation, self-reform, looking at 3 decades of opening reform, seeing the contradictions in the eye, and also setting a new course, charting a new course. So one of the things he said, and I really like what his report that he gave at the 20th National Congress, which was in 2022, and he basically made a critical assessment of that process of opening reform and opening up, basically the country that he had, taken the reins of a decade before. And this is I'm quoting, and it's because I think it's really strong words. And he said, great achievements had been secured in reform, opening up, and socialist modernization. At the same time, however, a number of prominent issues and problems, some of which had just been building for years, while others were emerging. They demanded urgent action. And then he goes on to list some things. For example, people had lost confidence in socialism. There was too much money worship or watered down leadership. He talked about a development path that was imbalanced, uncoordinated, and unsustainable. So that being said, those are pretty strong self-criticism being made by a leader of a country who'd been, leading the country for a decade. And so it's under this kind of criticism, self-criticism, a self-reflection of the party, of the country, recognizing its success, where we see strong, really important moves, such as the party campaign, which we talked about, which is something that, she inaugurated at the first moment that he came to power. But it comes in other areas. The most important, not the most important, one of the most important is the fight against corruption. Anyone who had visited mainland China, 15, 20 years ago could feel the palpability, it's palpable, the corruption that exists on so many levels. Of course, bringing in that amount of private capital and all of that, capitalist relations, let's say, even though China is not a capitalist country, in my opinion, it distorts and just many things, including, the temptations towards corruption. So this whole idea of, his famous speech of saying, okay, I'm going to go not only after the flies, but the tigers. We've really seen that happen in the last 10 years. We're talking about people who are highest levels of leadership, whether they're in the, Central Committee to the Politburo of the Communist Party of China, to, ministers, to former heads of banks. Many people have been really taken in, addressed by the by the anti-corruption efforts. And this has actually built a lot of confidence amongst the people. I know the West likes to frame this as, oh, he's trying to consolidate his own personal political power. But a lot of the people, if you talk to regular people, they say, wow, we can feel the difference. This is a government that is serious about addressing one of the plagues that came with this period of reform. But then you see other things, and we could probably do a separate show just on it, around how to basically reel in the excesses of capital, in the worst areas that we've seen it, whether it's in the big tech, the Chinese government has come in really hard on the big tech, the monopolistic practices, um, questions of the privatization of several sectors, including education. That was a huge crackdown on the sort of predatory sectors, on education, on housing speculation. The famous kind of campaign to say housing is for living, not for speculation. Um, and so we can see these changes, I think, that define the new era, which is not only to lift the rest of the people into, the kind of period of what's called common prosperity, but also reel in, and this is where we see political power exercising its authority over capital. And this is where I think is very, very different from a, Western capitalist society, how the government intervenes, how the authority intervenes in these sort of areas.
Maybe here I'd like to zoom in just a little bit and maybe we can touch on this briefly, but perhaps what are your insights into what is sort of driving this new era? I assume that it's some combination of post 2008, the neoliberal path and sort of linking with the West, just didn't seem as viable anymore. I imagine, there's an element of it that is sort of within the party or, for lack of a better term, top down. But also, I can imagine that it's absolutely not divorced from what's going on sort of with the masses and in terms of, working class struggles. Etc. So, I mean, yeah, those are just sort of my guesses. I'd like to hear some of your thoughts on what is really driving the coming into of this new era.
I think it's definitely many factors. I would say, of course, many of these things have been under the leadership of Xi, and I think Xi is very much informed by his own life experience and his politicization, right? One of the things that I felt really impacted is last year for May Day, because in China it's a extended holiday. I went to Yan'an, which is the where the Long March had ended, and it's the revolutionary base before, the seizing of power. And there, the famous leaders had lived in caves, because locally people live in these kind of cave homes or homes that are dug into, the mountains. And they were very humble conditions. And then I also had a chance to visit the village, um, which is also in Yan'an, where Xi Jinping was sent in his teenage years during the Cultural Revolution to live and work amongst the peasants. And he also lived in one of these cave homes, but of course it was in the 1970s. What I found quite interesting is, I mean, you have to understand, like President Xi was the son of the former vice premier of the country. He came, his father was on the Long March. He's one of the first generation red leaders, right? And so by the time he was born in the halls of power, in Beijing. And so for him as a teenager to go and live amongst and work with the peasants, he lived there for 7 years from when he was 15 to 22 when he entered university, not as, someone from a privileged class background, but he entered through the merit of being a worker, a soldier, a peasant, a candidate. And so those 7 years, he actually tried to apply to be part of the party, I think, for 9 times and failed 8 of them before he could join. He started at the village level, started as a village secretary. I'm only saying all of this because that period, I do believe, really did inform how he understood where the base and the strength of the nation was, which is really in the countryside. And this is why immediately as he took power as the president, turns to the countryside as this major initiative. And there are many things of that because let's be honest, during the period of opening reform, there was a detachment of the party from the grassroots, especially retreat from the countryside. There was huge mass migration, hundreds of millions of people became migrant workers in the cities. We know the story very well to work in factories, etc., to build the things, for the rest of the world, to become the factory of the world. It came at a huge cost to the working class of the Chinese people. But he knew that the first thing that needs to be done is reestablishing the party with the grassroots, with the base, with that vital force that drives Chinese society, not just the revolution in 1949, but till today. And so I think linking that personal experience with that, political commitment, he understood that that was one of the, sore areas when we're talking about 100 million people still living in extreme poverty, you know, the famous saying that Deng Xiaoping said, poverty is not socialism. It's not possible that someone in a Shanghai first tier city is living like they could be living in Manhattan or London or any of the first world, capitals. But then you have still people in the countryside living in extreme poverty. So to correct that imbalance and in a imbalanced development. Actually, it's important to say that that became the new principal contradiction because in different moments of the historical eras that we're talking about, there's the party actually has defined a principal contradiction of the Chinese society. And under, the first moment under Mao was basically class struggle, the working class peasantry against the bourgeoisie. And then in the second period under Deng Xiaoping was how do you develop the productive forces quickly, marked by the opening up reform period. But under Xi, it's now a new stage, new principal contradiction, which is how to address the unbalanced and inadequate development in the country. So all the things I listed, with poverty alleviation being the key thing, was part of understanding that this is the corrective measure that needs to be done in this new era, without which it would threaten many of the advances that have been made, because that kind of polarization could lead to all kinds of not only economic ills, but also social ills, amongst other things.
Okay. So you're with the Tricontinental, and we've had, many actually folks on the program from the Tricontinental. We've had Vijay Prashad, um, we've had Pilar Troya Fernandez and Harleen Kaur to talk about imperialist war and feminist resistance in the global South. And the Tricontinental has recently been commemorating the 70th anniversary of the Bandung Conference, which took place in 1955. An assembly of leaders from newly emerging global south, newly independent global south countries, basically for the first time. Um, it's maybe to close out our section on poverty alleviation. How do you reflect on the poverty alleviation campaign from the broader perspective of the rest of the global south? I know we touched on this a little bit, but perhaps we can zoom in on what other global south countries can learn from China in this regard, because it really is sort of the breaking of a path here.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think you don't have to be a leftist. You just have to be a decent human being to care about poverty, and understand that poverty is one of the biggest plagues or dilemmas facing humanity. It has to be the top of the agenda. If a society cannot resolve the basic, conditions for a dignified life of its people, I mean, that's not a society we want to be living in. Um, and so, but of course, we know that, countries such as China, as we started to talk about, comparing, you made the comparison between India and China, these are countries of the former third world, the formerly colonized countries, centuries of humiliation combined of under imperialism and colonial occupation, war, and just we know the story very well. It's starting from different conditions in a global north country. We just know that. And so for China to be able to achieve this out of, these shared conditions is something, of course, for global South countries to study, not to mimic, not to say that this is a copy and paste model that can just easily be replicated, of course not, but something that has to be learned from and studied with care and seriousness. And one of the things is when I was writing this study on the poverty initiative in China, it was really shocking to see because we were living through the pandemic, and the pandemic uh, basically exacerbated all kinds of social ills that were already existent. And one of the big things is we saw these massive numbers of people falling into extreme poverty, falling, rather than, marching towards these sort of UN, social development goals of eliminating extreme poverty by 2030, we're actually farther and farther away of reaching those goals. In fact, in 2020, when we wrote this study, and when China announced at the end of that year of the eradication of extreme poverty, something like 75 million people in sub-Saharan, mostly sub-Saharan Africa and Southern Asia, had fallen back into poverty, which was the highest, increase of poverty since 1998. So we were seeing these numbers that were quite shocking. And in fact, the numbers then were saying that the total number of people living in extreme poverty would increase by another 250 million people by 2030, exacerbated by the pandemic and all the, associated economic and social crises. And so that means that, we're looking towards, in 5 years' time, we're going to have over 1 billion people living under extreme poverty, not to count all the people who are malnourished, living in poverty under all sorts of abject conditions. So, with all that in mind, of course, China's, eradication of extreme poverty is something that needs to be studied and understood in order for us to ensure that that 1 billion people are lifted out of extreme poverty, because we cannot have a society that is, so basically plagued by an illness, this illness that is produced out of capitalism, is produced out of, neoliberal policies. We know the sources of them, you know, cannot ever thrive, cannot have a possibility of having a sovereign, independent, national project that so many of our countries and so many of our people fought and died for, right? That process of national liberation you mentioned, that Bandung really helped represent because it was the first time that mostly Asian, but some African countries really stood up on our own feet and said, we, need to chart our course forward. We want to, a sovereign path to development, a dignified way to develop out of these conditions of colonialism and imperialist suppression. And so I think that project hasn't been finished. It took China those 7 decades to be able to just reach that, you know, stage of eliminating extreme poverty. That's something still, I think, very, very far from reach for most global South countries. So that eliminating extreme poverty, eliminating poverty, I think is very, very much tied with the unfinished project of national liberation.
Okay, I want to switch gears here a little bit and talk about the question of women's liberation in China. I think this is always important to talk about and not as much paid attention to in our in a previous episode that I did with Jyotishman, we in comparing India and China, one of the focal points there was the question of patriarchy, the institution of patriarchy, and women's liberation. Jyotishman was able to talk a little bit more about, the Indian side of things in terms of the institution of patriarchy, the disparities, between men and women. Maternal mortality is like super high in India, literacy lower, women's literacy lower. When we compare all these metrics with China, and I can imagine with some differences that a lot of other global South countries see, kind of a similar trend. So I want to start here. What has the institution of patriarchy looked like in pre-revolution China, and what strides were made during the Chinese Revolution of 1949, and also shortly after 1949, just that period to maybe start with.
Yeah, I think this is an essential question, of course, because I would actually say that the national awakening or the national liberation struggle in China was born out of the women's liberation struggle. We can actually even say that the women's liberation struggle preceded it. Um, one of the things, and of course, have never been separable. You cannot separate it in the Chinese experience or in any other revolutionary liberation struggle. Um, and one of the things is that yes, a couple of days ago was the May 4th. May 4th movement was a really important moment 100 years ago of over 100 years ago of national awakening, right? Basically, at the end of the World War I, after sort of contributions of China in different aspects or Chinese volunteers in different aspects with Western European countries, the idea was that Chinese territories would be returned to Chinese sovereignty. Of course, Europeans being Europeans betrayed us, and then that woke up, a lot of students took the streets, and that became a moment, wow, we need to defend our nation. But already in that moment, there was a lot of talking about the woman question, the women liberation question at that first instant. There was a lot of parallels of saying, okay, there's, the patriarchal feudal traditions that are plaguing Chinese society, that are keeping us literally bounded. And binding is a really strong image because of obviously the history of binding feet for women, etc. So to be able to kind of free from these binds, women being the symbol of that was really essential for the national struggle, or the nation being freed from its own binds. And Mao Zedong, already in that period of the kind of what's called the New Culture movement, this was writing, the first moments, it was about women. A lot of the early communist leaders, include men and women, were first writing about the women questions. So we're talking about, the fact that women in particular, especially peasant women, were suffering multiple layers of oppressions. Not only because we were living under a semi-colonial, semi-feudal society, but that they were also questions of, political or clan or original religious oppressions, as well as from, the institution of marriage at the hands of, sort of patriarchal familial relations, husbands, fathers, sons. So some of the earliest writings from Mao were actually about the women question, which I find really interesting. And so it's from that the idea of it's not just a feudal country, but it's a feudal patriarchal country was what was already, it was linked together from the beginning. And these were those, he called them these thick ropes that bind the Chinese people. And he was already writing about that when he was doing his many investigations in different regions, understanding the peasant question. He most famously wrote the report on the investigation of the Hunan peasant movement in 1926, which is really beginning to say, okay, we can't just focus on the urban worker, industrial worker struggle. We need to go to the base, the masses, which is the peasant struggle. Okay, that's the long things to say, just that already in the, 1919 afterwards, the 20s, the question of what women's liberation, emancipation was already tied to the national question. Of course, come 1949, this had to be put into practice. I mean, one of the first laws that the PRC implemented was the marriage law, several months after the declaration of the PRC, which allowed basically to undo many of these feudal customs, such as arranged marriage, something that we still see in many, many countries, arranged marriage, child marriage, polygamy, of course, only for men, and then also advocated for women's, economic independence, ability to divorce, participation in the workforce, consensual marriage, et cetera, et cetera. So that was a really pivotal victory for the women struggle. Of course, when you fast forward to 70 years today, China's a very different China. The questions are still, the question, it's not that China has eradicated patriarchy after 70, I guess how many years now? 76 years of the revolution. There's still many issues, and maybe we can talk about that a little bit more. One thing I wanted to just bring us back to the poverty study, and one person that I had met that helps kind of frame, because it's in her lifetime. All of this is in her lifetime, which is so shocking. It's in the lifetime of her grandmothers. And I met this grandmother, and she's was born in the early 50s, so just after the PRC was formed. She kind of was born around the same time. And when I thought about her, her surname is He, so grandmother He. The what country was she born in at the time? We talked about already how poor China was. If when she was born, her life expectancy was supposed to be 35 years. 35 years. Many countries of, Asia, Africa would have had that, but China was pretty low. Likely she would have been, her future would have been, pre-revolution, wedded off as a child. She would have stayed illiterate her whole life. And I don't know, born how many children. In her lifetime, she saw the average lifespan of, Chinese people more than double, even in the first 30 years actually under Mao that already doubled. We see illiteracy go from, for women, it was almost all illiterate to over 95% literacy. We're talking about many of these traditions, these feudal patriarchal traditions dismantled. We see, the life expectancy now, surpassing or around the same as the US at 78 years, for a country that is by large intents purposes way wealthier in many metrics than China is. And here, she is one of the people that in, 70 years later exits extreme poverty out of this, targeted poverty alleviation campaign. And it was really nice to hear from her stories because you can see how in different moments of the revolutionary process, how her life has made significant advances, And the most recent is because she actually moved to a new community. And for the first time, her all her children and grandchildren live in one place instead of having, her children for many years migrated to other cities to work. Grandchildren often stayed with her. For the first time in her whole life experience is that they all live together in a community, you know, instead of having to walk her grandchild to work, school 2 hours, each way from the old village, she now lives in a community where there are several schools, there are several health clinics, there are, everything is 5-minute walk away. And I was really touched to hear that story and think about, and it helps us think about what has the revolutionary process, as young as it is, but also measured against, the poorest and most dispossessed, which is, the rural peasant woman in the kind of outskirts, in the most remote areas of China. And so I think that says something about the process of, liberation of women in these last decades.
That's certainly very interesting. Um, Yeah, I actually did want to talk a little bit more about the connection between women's liberation and the poverty alleviation campaign. I think you touched on that. That's great. Um, Maybe to close out this section, I did want to just ask, the reform and opening up period, many have argued that that sort of saw, so post 78, 1978, saw, somewhat of a backsliding of the condition of women or the question of women's liberation. How has this question of women's liberation evolved in China with time, but particularly focusing post reform and opening up? And in this new era that we're talking about, are there any, is there a palpable sort of shift in the approach to that question and the question of women's liberation?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. No doubt that there was, I think, major impacts. I mean, one of the things, for example, a lot of people in the pre-reform period, if you're, for example, a factory worker, um, your whole social reproduction was basically taken care for you, right? Because you lived You not only worked, both if you're in a kind of nuclear family situation, which many people were, both parents would be working and employed in the factory. You probably have your wedding ceremony, organized in the factory. Your housing is taken care of, your food, childcare, schooling, everyone, basically your life was provided in that factory setting. And of course, as we saw with the opening up reform period, a lot of that system did get dismantled. And a lot of those, large scale state-run factories, entered privatization. And it was a period that was also really complicated. So, so no doubt that those kinds of structures really, and especially impacting women. Um, and then we see different things, right? I mean, I want to say that, you know, again, emphasizing patriarchy has not been abolished as much as we would like to see it abolished in China. And I think that's part of the long road to socialism is that we must ensure that that is. It's not there yet. So I would say maybe some of the challenges we see in this new era, there are many. One of the th really important things is that China demographically is facing huge challenges. We have now a fifth of the population is aged above 60 who are elders. And this figure is supposed to reach 30% by 2035, so in the next 10 years. And in China terms, that's 400 million people. So, and what's even more surprisingly is that by 2050, 25 years from now, China's going to be shrinking, and it might even be before then. So what happens is that we have some democratic challenges also because in that history of opening reform, remember the famous, infamous one-child policy that was adopted in 1980. I think we could understand it now looking back as very harsh, but likely necessary controls on reproductive freedom to control population and control many kinds of things that came with hunger and poverty, etc. But many of those one-child parents are now those people entering the 60s. So it means that they have, the single children have much more burden in taking care of the elders. We call them the sandwich generation. And in Chinese, there's a saying to say basically above there are the old and below there are the young. So this, one child generation has to take care of, those above and those below. And it's kind of a distorted kind of not quite a pyramid. You're kind of squished in the middle. And we know that, of course, care work in any society, it's women that bear the brunt of that. And so even though that China has lifted the one-child policy, I mean, as of 2016, two-child policy, then became three-child policy, we're seeing the lowest birth rates since 1952. I think you can credit partly the lack of the social support structures that were there in the early socialist period. Um, Higher, it also is linked to the fact that there's higher incomes. And usually as the society moves up, the income rates go, and people enter the so-called middle class, it means there are lower birth rates. We see that around, the advanced capitalist societies and the cost of raising children, et cetera. So the government's trying to do many things to sort of offset, subsidies. Many places like big cities, they're trying to do pilot programs for childcare and making sure that they're accessible in all the communities. It's going to be a big challenge because ultimately, a lot of women not only do not want to, get married, have children, take care, do the care work, we also have to build the social infrastructure to make that happen. So I want to say that those are major challenges. And I think for women, especially young women, it's a big question moving ahead. But one thing I do want to say though, I think oftentimes in the West, um, the voices that get privileged, including I think I'm part of that, people who have access to English, who have been educated in the West, who can speak to the West, like myself, who have access to Western social media platforms, they often get individually sort of selected, handpicked by Western media, Western mainstream media to talk about some of the ills of society. And usually coming from people who are, upper or middle class people living in the cities. And I think that's where the importance of always not judging from sort of select voices that the West can access, but really measuring against the poorest, The most dispossessed, the grandmotherhoods, the peasant women living in the rural countryside to really understand, okay, how is China actually faring on the woman question, on the feminist question, and have a more material basis because it's questions such as poverty, such as hunger, that really health, maternity, what's it called? Childcare, mortality, maternity mortality. These kinds of things are really what I think the metrics of whether or not we should be gauging China's success on the women question on. Maybe I'll pause there and we can see because like as you can see, I can ramble a lot and not let you speak very much.
No, that's totally fine. And just on that, I mean, it's totally true that, there needs to be a much more substantive, view of the so-called women's question. I mean, I was recently watching an interview, from the Hong Kong Foreign Correspondents Club, I believe. I might be getting the name wrong, but something along those lines. But uh, you know, American journalist interviewing a businessman from China, and the one question about you know, the condition of women is, how come there's no not sufficient representation of women in the Communist Party? And sure, like the Chinese business person had responded, sure, that that's perhaps one place to work on. That critique is well and fair, but often that's sort of a transplanted kind of perspective from Western liberal circles, unable to see the women's question beyond representation. Yeah, so okay, cool. So thanks for that rundown. Let's perhaps try to close out on this. I'll maybe try to I'll keep, I'll maybe combine my two questions. We're sort of running out of time, and I also want to let you go. But I did want to talk a little bit about one country, two systems. You and I are both from Hong Kong. You also have a connection to Macau, which is also under the one country, two systems policy. And maybe for listeners, I might rewind a little bit. One country, two systems is sort of the outcome of the consensus of what happened to the former um, colonies within China. So Macau was colonized by the Portuguese until 1999. That was the year that I was born, and Hong Kong was a British colony for more than 150 years until 1997. So it's interesting, colonialism isn't this really old thing, I mean, it's funny. I think about this sometimes. Myself and my sibling, we're sort of the first generation to not live under the British Crown. Like my grandmother, who's still alive, born in 39, in British India under the British Crown. My my paternal side all grew up in British Hong Kong, under the Crown as well. My mom, who later moved to British Hong Kong, and at the tail end of the colonial period. And it's really like my generation that's the first generation not under the British Crown. But then again, I'm here in Canada now, we're still under the Crown. We have the King apparently coming to visit later this month and open the session of Parliament. So this is, I mean, really a ridiculous thing. So anyway, one country, two systems was the policy post handover of Macau and Hong Kong, to preserve, the same sort of economic system, have it, somewhat open to the West, and have a distinct kind of system from the political system and the economic system in the mainland. One country, two systems has now, been in place in Macau and Hong Kong for 26 and 28 years, respectively, and has endured some challenges over these years, particularly in Hong Kong, with the recent 2019-2020 protests. Admittedly, those challenges, especially in Hong Kong, have maybe been a little bit more on the one country side than the two system side. It's also a little bit on the two system side because, part of the some of the demands, and or at least how the demands were framed in Hong Kong were around the electoral, or the political system, and wanting greater electoral kind of Western style liberal democracy. Um, but on this, maybe I'd like to focus more on the two system side. How do you reflect on this? And because maybe I can give my 2 cents, and I don't want to drive the conversation here, but like part of one country, two systems, and preserving the two systems is you preserve sort of the colonial system. Hong Kong has huge a homeless not homeless, it's homeless too, but huge housing problem. Housing is extremely unaffordable, some of the most unaffordable in the world. so you don't have the same kind of egalitarian basis as, the mainland, or at least the basis for that. The education system, for example, is basically, I went through the local system in Hong Kong. It's essentially the colonial education system. Those are some of my reflections on it. But how do you reflect on one country, two systems more broadly? And I might add on here, I'm sorry if I'm going on for a little bit. I've recently been reading that, you know, since 2020 onwards, Hong Kong has sort of seen decline in the number of restaurants, for example, being registered in Hong Kong because people are preferring to spend their money in Shenzhen or in the Greater Bay Area, on the mainland side where things are cheaper. I've also been reading that a lot more Hong Kong people are crossing the border into the mainland to receive healthcare. So there are shifts happening. How do you? So this is just maybe broad, and I'll leave it at how do you reflect on one country, two systems, the two system side, and sort of going forward. Hong Kong in particular and Macau has been playing some kind of role interfacing between China and the rest of the world. How do you see one country, two systems going forward? I know that was a lot there. I'm sorry about that.
No, this is like, a fascinating question, and I think your inputs are relevant. You actually lived in Hong Kong longer than I did, so I mean, in a way, I mean, of course, one country, two systems was a bit of a, you can call it a compromise, you could call it an innovation, you could call it an experiment, it's something that had never been done before exactly, How do you actually wrest yourself from this, century of humiliation, regain sovereignty, but at the same time maintain the kinds of strategic aspects that Hong Kong has always played in terms of as a hub of capital and finance that has its contributions to, construction of China as a whole. And so, and we understand that it was, quite a bold proposal under Deng Xiaoping to sort of let that capitalist system continue while somehow reintegrating Hong Kong and Macau back into the nation. And without, I guess, immediately or trying to avoid immediate or most direct conflict with those entrenched colonial systems that you talked about, that would be it the political system, the legal system, the education system, cultural, etc. It really penetrates every area. 156 years of colonialism doesn't, end overnight. And we see that. And I think the cultural side we see way more, lags way more behind the economic side. And in a way, I think, you mentioned, of course, everyone paid attention to the 2019 and 2020 protests. It shows some limits of that model where it had come ahead to a head where, things weren't, adding up. I think in a way, the West, of course, framed those protests say that they were clearly, rooted in material struggles, real things. Anyone who's been to Hong Kong or has lived in Hong Kong knows absolutely. We began the conversation before we started recording on just absolute unaffordability of the city, rents and housing prices pushed up by this wild real estate speculation, the infamous tycoons, my family members live three generations in a tiny shoebox. The future is grim for many young people, that was the reality, especially leading up in the 2019 protests, and people were looking, for other things. Of course, we know that this also brought back a whole set of, narratives that have been there and perpetrated too, whether it's an anti-communist narratives, who is the enemy, There was narratives around really being recolonized by the Chinese people, Chinese government, central government, which is kind of bizarre to think about. There's all kinds of colonial nostalgia, including amongst young people, people who had never even lived under colonialism, somehow have this romanticization of a thing that never was. Let's be honest, under British colonial rule, Hong Kong did not have democracy, did not have labor rights, did not have housing protections. It was really a capitalist outpost that served a handful of really of elites at the cost of the working class, living in the shanty towns where my father grew up. Anyways, any of those minor gains were really fought for in the 1967 protests led by the communists, and that force a certain level of concessions before they hand over it. But that part obviously gets forgotten. And then some, I think, even misguided people, go and hold up the Union Jack in the Legislative Assembly, these kinds of things we saw. We know that that stuff was also um, very good fodder to promote, Western NGOs, NED, all that kind of funding. I think that story has already been told many times again. But what I think is interesting now is I think there is a shift, and I see it. And I was just talking to my mom, she's in Hong Kong now, but she spent the weekend in Macau with her friends, and then went over to Zhuhai to eat amazing seafood all weekend. I was just like mouth watering with wanting to eat the seafood that she was eating. My uncle, who's a taxi driver in Hong Kong, he's less than sympathetic to communism, spends his weekends going to Shenzhen to eat and shop because it's just frankly a more dynamic city. It's a place that, he can, with his, income, can, enjoy a certain quality of life that is really hard in Hong Kong. Um, so in a way, I think we're going to have to see what this next period looks like, more the one country part than the two systems, of this sort of what we're seeing, this Greater Bay, plan. It's happening. You really do see that. A lot of people already, and I know because of the privatized healthcare and the pretty awful public healthcare system in Hong Kong, are really actually reaping some of the benefits of socialism in mainland China by going to, they're getting vouchers to be able to go to use the hospitals in China, the public hospitals in mainland China. So maybe in some ways, I think we might see in the next period where there'll be a little softening up of like, oh, is socialism so bad? Because on the whole, one of the things is this integration into one country didn't come with all those benefits that an average mainland Chinese person gained, which is through the revolutionary process, which is questions of land reform, which is questions of this, even the we were talking about the women's emancipation question, talking about, all kinds of aspects, education, et cetera, et cetera. Those things have never touched Hong Kong. And so for people to have their sort of doubts about evil communism, evil socialism, because they've actually never benefited from the socialist revolution. But I don't know. I mean, I'm not saying that I'm trying to gloss over the real difficulties, but I think at this point, um, you know, as we're seeing, I think, a new Cold War being imposed into China and increasingly aggressively so, this kind of sort of one country integration part, is absolutely not optional. And I think from an anti-imperialist view, it's absolutely necessary to affirm that, because otherwise Hong Kong will remain basically a permanent outpost for possible foreign interference, for all kinds of things that we've been seeing that it's played for a long time. And I think that becomes even more and more important as, I think the US is edging or, really placing China as its number one existential enemy. And that's very dangerous for the people, both sides, whether you're in Hong Kong, Macau, or in the mainland of China. And of course, I think the world.
That's right. And I think that's also a good note to end on. So that's, it's been a great conversation, Tings. I really appreciate your time. And you've been generous with it. Could you perhaps just let the listeners know where to find your work, and just anything else you'd like to plug?
Yeah, absolutely. If anyone is interested in China, please do check out the journal we've been publishing through Tricontinental. It's a partnership with a Chinese magazine, but we're trying to translate and bring voices from, Chinese thinkers on not only about, China's own development, but also, world questions, questions that concern all of us. And that's called 文化纵横, and you can find that on the Tricontinental website. It's all free for download. And in terms of my work, aside from the things I do at Tricontinental, which is all there, you can just follow me on social media. You can find me at Tings Chak and different places. So yeah, it's not a common name, so you'll probably be able to find me through a quick Google search. But thank you so much, Ashwin, for having me on your program.
Yes, of course. And I should say for listeners that I've also, read through at least some editions of 文化中 and it's it's very interesting to say the least. And I would encourage listeners to check it out as well. Thanks again, Tings. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.